Okay, hi everyone. I'm Major Sharon Cisparo, and welcome to our next Marine Women's Initiative team discussion. And I am so excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Stacy Sims. Dr. Stacy Sims is a physiologist and nutrition scientist who specializes in sex differences. Her research in female performance has led to her mantra of women are not small men, so we have to stop training and feeling like one. She wrote the book Roar, How to Match Your Food and Fitness to Your Unique Female Physiology for Optimal Performance, Great Health, and a Strong Lean Body for Life, and currently serves as the Senior Research Fellow at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, where they are really being intentional about sex differences and the different training necessary for men and women. She has a new book coming out soon about perimenopause and menopausal changes in female athletes, which I think is absolutely essential knowledge for any female service member who remains on active duty beyond their mid-30s. I would love to see her books get onto the Commandant's reading list for Marine leaders because it is just that important. But before we get started, let's give the disclaimer. The views expressed here are those of the group and do not reflect the official policy or position of the Marine Corps, the Department of the Navy, Department of Defense, US government, or the University of Waikato. Dr. Sims, thank you for speaking with your Marines, because you're an American citizen. We are your Marines and other female service members today. Could you start by telling us a little bit about how you got into female research?
Oh, yeah. So being an inquisitive child, growing up all over the place, always asking questions. I got to a point when I was at university in Indiana and I was on the crew team. And the men and the women would train the same, and the men always seemed to peak at the right point for the races. But the women always seemed a bit flat. And we'd also have times where the boat was flat and shouldn't be, and it just wasn't really explainable. And I'd ask questions about it, and they're like, oh, you're just not training hard enough, or might have just been an off day. And then at the same time, I was in the academics classes learning about exercise physiology and nutrition, and I would volunteer to be in the metabolism labs as a participant. And there are some times when they would throw my results out because they were anomalies. And I started really trying to understand why some points they would throw them out, other points they would keep them. And it started coming down to times in the menstrual cycle or how I was feeling. And I started really asking these questions like, why are you throwing them out? Oh, well, we don't know enough about women, or we don't know enough about men, so why are we going to study women? And a lot of women aren't studied, we just generalize. And being an inquisitive person and really wanting to do the best, I'm like, that's not good enough. Like, I am not a guy, I don't want to be generalized to, and I want these answers. So that was kind of like the point at my beginning of my academic career, as well as an athlete, going, I can't believe that all these questions that I have can't be answered adequately. And so that kind of stemmed my interest into, well, what's best for me? What's best for my teammates? So as an athlete going through professional bike racing, Ironman, Xterra, all sorts of stuff, really trying to help teammates understand that there are different points where they're going to feel bad and different points are going to feel good. And then being able to answer those questions in the lab as I went along, just kind of accumulated in the past 20 some odd years of research and experience.
That's awesome. So what were some of the differences that you first identified? So I know that you talk a lot in your book about our hormonal cycle and how men go through essentially just the same hormonal system the entire time, and then women, we're all over the place. We're like a hurricane. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because we are professional athletes as Marines and as service members. And so this is a very interesting discussion for us, because we usually just have kind of a one size fits all program for us.
Right, exactly. And I think that's been the vocal conversation about menstrual cycle and training stuff until about the past 3 or 4 years. People really started getting into, hey, wait a second, what's going on here? Because we know that sex hormones have different responses. Most of the time, we just think about it as reproductive, or as women, we think about our menstrual cycle as being a pain in the butt because now we have our period. What do we do about it? But if we look inherently about what our hormones do and how they affect every system of our body, we can start to understand how we can use them to our advantage. So if we look at the menstrual cycle itself, and a typical textbook menstrual cycle is 28 days, where day one is the first day of bleeding. You have relatively low hormone until around day 9 or 10. Estrogen starts to come up. It surges right before ovulation, which is around day 12 or 13. After ovulation, Estrogen takes a dip, then starts coming back up. Progesterone comes up. And so the 10-ish days before your period starts again, this is a high hormone phase. Now, this is the phase that men don't want to study women because our physiology is so different. These hormones affect every system of our body. They cross the blood-brain barrier and can cause central nervous system fatigue. They can cause anxiety. They can cause depression. They change the way our body fuels itself. So we can't access carbohydrates very well, but we can access free fatty acids really well. Our core temperature is up. Our thermoregulatory system has been shifted, so we have less heat tolerance. So there's all these interesting changes that occur that when you're looking from a research perspective, it interferes, quote, too much with what people are going after, so they won't study women in that phase. Hopefully, as the things are changing in the past 4 or 5 years, that's becoming a moot point. But what happens when we look from a training perspective is almost everything that we know from a training perspective is either from male data sets or they're from women studied in that low hormone phase where we are more like men. So in that low hormone phase, we can access carbohydrate, we can hit high intensities. That surge of estrogen right before ovulation is a time where we can hit really hard, heavy training and recover really well because estrogen is anabolic in its own right without progesterone interfering. And so when we start to understand how these hormones can affect adaptations, we can manipulate our training in and around our own unique cycles to maximize the training stress. Because it's not the training where we get fitter, it's overcoming the stress. So if we go and do a really hard, high intense workout 4 days before our period, we're not going to get the same adaptive stress as if we were to do that same hard, heavy workout 4 days into our period when our hormones are low. So when we start to understand how these hormones can directly affect us, we can empower ourselves to get better training methods, better training adaptations, and better recovery, better body composition, better self-efficacy, and across the board, more performance potential.
Are there any recommendations that you have for how we should be fueling during those different cycles, and any maybe if you had a perfect opportunity to plan your training, what that should look like during those different cycles? We don't always have that luxury as Marines. I mean, sometimes we go to the field and all that kind of stuff, but maybe what some of the things that we could do just to help that along.
Yeah, so the way I approach it is there's a training metric where you can control everything. And then there's the performance metric where it's out of your hands. It's the same as, like I tell professional athletes, you can't tell Ironman to change world championships because it's 2 days before your period. You just have to learn to level the playing field. Like, what can I do or what nutritional interventions can I do to level that hormone playing field? So if we talk about a training scope, as I described, you can really manipulate your training in and around what your hormones are doing to maximize the training effect. But if we're looking from that performance and having to perform at different points in your cycle where you can't change that metric, in the high hormone phase, we're looking at supplementing with branched chain amino acids in and around training or in and around times of high stress, high fatigue, because branched chains in particular, leucine, cross a blood-brain barrier using the same mechanism as tryptophan. So instead of tryptophan coming over and making you more fatigued and causing more central nervous system fatigue, you have more leucine that crosses over and helps mitigate that central nervous system. If you're looking at higher protein intake across the board at more regular doses in that high hormone phase, then you actually stay out of what we call that catabolic or breakdown state, which is super important when we're trying to gain lean mass and reduce body fat. And then we're looking at carbohydrate as well, because our body cannot access a lot of carbohydrate very well in that high hormone phase, supplementing with things like glucose tablets. Super easy, pop in your mouth, and it keeps a constant blood sugar level. They're designed to boost blood sugar in diabetics without having to interfere with digestion. So there's small little quick hits that you can have that placate to improve your physiological responses so that the low hormone and the high hormone phase don't become issues.
That's unbelievably helpful. Do you have any recommendations for, say, after a workout, what we should be eating? Because I know that there are some of these differences, that there's unique fueling needs for us as women that differ from men.
Yeah, so we talk about sex differences, and it's not just hormone driven. There are sex differences from birth. There are sex differences in muscle mitochondrial protein. So women are more able to use and store fatty acids. So we have more intramuscular fat. We're really good at long endurance stuff. But we also have less of an enzyme for fast twitch fibers, and we have a predisposition to come back down to baseline a lot faster than men. So when we're looking from a recovery scope, it's at 30 to 45 minutes post-training that we can really nail down some good nutritional habits to maximize our recovery. So we need a good dose of protein. Everyone's heard the chocolate milk campaign, 20 grams, have some chocolate milk. It's good for men, but it's not enough protein for women. We are looking at around that 30-gram mark post-exercise. And when we get into peri and postmenopause, it's closer to the 40-gram mark. And this is having to do with the way estrogen affects the satellite cell of muscle protein synthesis. So when we're looking at a reproductive years premenopausal woman, we're looking at around that 30-gram dose of protein within 30 minutes. And it does a few things. It helps improve the amount of carbohydrate that gets put back in the muscles over a longer period of time. So it extends the window of glycogen replacement. It also stops that breakdown effect. And that's really super important, because if we stay in a catabolic state or that breakdown state for a long period of time, we start to perturb our endocrine system. So what I mean by that is there's this little neuropeptide called kisspeptin. Now, kisspeptin is very responsible for turning the endocrine system on and off. It's sensitive to nutritional status. So if you stay in a breakdown state for a longer period of time after a high stress of exercise, then kisspeptin gets a signal there's not enough food. So it starts to downturn a little bit. And the response is a lowered resting metabolic rate. We have a little bit of thyroid dysfunction, and we start to get menstrual cycle irregularities. These are all signs that things are not quite right, like we don't have full endocrine health. And the outcomes of that are increased body fat. So we put on belly fat. We are more predisposed to put on more fat in and around the tricep area as well, big storage areas. Really, really fatigued, and we can't hit high intensities because our body's like, hey, wait a second, everything's downturning. We want to minimize stress. And then, a few months down the road, your periods stop. So when we talk about getting out of that catabolic state, it's super, super important after exercise to have that nutrition. And so many people are like, oh, wait, no, I want to lose weight, or I want to minimize calorie intake to help change body composition or lose weight. So I'm going to delay my food intake, which is the exact opposite of what people should be doing. If you're looking to lose body fat, you're looking to lose body weight, you fuel your body after that high stress. It gets the signaling that we're not conserving, so that it will allow the body to do what it needs to do from a metabolic standpoint to change body composition, to get you fitter, to get you stronger, to get you leaner.
That right there, I mean, just that advice alone could help shift a lot of what our training schedules look like. So in the Marine Corps, we have recruit training and then officer candidate training. And I don't remember, I mean, I remember certainly shifts in when we ate breakfast, whether it was before or after a PT event, but that information right there is enough for us to really take a hard look at how we lay out our training schedules. I have to admit, I am one of those people that after a hard workout, I did not eat anything because I thought I need to cut weight. So in the Marine Corps, I mean, in all of Department of Defense, we have very strict body composition standards. We have to weigh a certain amount. It's based on the BMI system, which I'm sure you enjoy. And then we also have a way of measuring body fat, which is, we know, has been very detrimental to women because we measure the butt and then the waist and then the neck for a calculation or an estimation of our body fat. But often I have done that where I've worked out and then I've just said, no, I'm not going to eat anything for a couple hours because I want my body to keep burning. And what you're telling me is that I've just been destroying my body, which I am now seeing later on in life. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And everyone talks about the EPOC or the post-exercise burn or increased calorie burn. It's doing that for a short period of time because your body's in such a stressed breakdown state. By giving it nutrition when it needs it, it helps stop that breakdown state and start the anabolic process, the building process of lean mass going up, upping the carbohydrate that's in your muscles and decreasing inflammation. And so when you don't decrease inflammation, when you are in this catabolic state, you hold on to weight as well. And it's also a signal to keep extra body water, keep extra body fat. And it's a huge misstep in the whole fitness and health industry of saying, no, calories in, calories out. You want to, make sure that you do a hard workout or do a fasted workout, where it's such a disservice to women in particular, because we need that nutrition in and around our training, and then we can play with our diet away from training. If we're looking to cut some calories because we need to lose a little body fat, you're upping protein with a little bit of calorie restriction, but that calorie restriction is away from your training. Fueling for the stress, manipulating calorie content later so that you're getting a slight calorie restriction is so much better at giving you the energy, keeping you out of low energy availability, and allowing your body to lose extra body fat. We know also if you have a higher protein intake with a slight calorie restriction, your body fat comes down rather rapidly. You preserve and can gain lean mass. So it's, again, looking at the timing and the quality of the diet, and definitely not doing fasted training or delaying food intake post-training.
So that actually gets me into my next question about fat. Oftentimes we are told fasted training. Is there, do you have recommendations for what we should eat pre-workout? Because oftentimes, our PT session is at maybe 5 in the morning or something like that. So it's really early. I hate eating breakfast. So I really have to force something down. What is your recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, early morning, no one has an appetite, and you're looking at, okay, I'm going to have to do burpees and I'm going to have to do sprints, and I don't want a lot of stuff in my stomach because I don't want to vomit either. So it's not about a full meal. It can be something as simple as a banana. It could be a protein fortified latte. So it's a cold brew coffee with a scoop of protein powder in it that you're drinking on the way to PT. So it's just something that's small to bring blood sugar up and drop cortisol. Because if you can drop cortisol and bring blood sugar up, it's a signal that there's nutrition. And then you're looking at post-exercise, having your real meal, having your breakfast within 30 minutes of post-PT. If that's not available, then you're looking at, okay, well, maybe I'm having a ready-to-go higher protein shake that's going to be my in-between or my primer to stop that catabolic state until I can get to a real meal.
How about any, so speaking about some of those different kinds of diets, oftentimes we hear intermittent fasting. So, okay, now I think everyone's on board. We're not going to fast before a workout. We're not going to fast after a workout. But what about all those other applications? Because we do really have to fit into a certain box of height and weight, unfortunately.
I know. So when I look at all the diet trends that are out there, they're just a means of restrictive dieting, right? So you're thinking about the low carb, high fat, you're eliminating something. You're talking about ketogenic, you're eliminating something. Intermittent fasting, you're eliminating something. The fasted training as well, you're eliminating something. So when you're looking at what are we eliminating and what are the repercussions, the more you eliminate, the more your gut microbiome is perturbed. And we need our gut microbiome to work for us. We need it because it produces so many different metabolites that are essential for losing weight and staying healthy, especially for brain health. When we're looking at intermittent fasting, people fall into these big catabolic states again. So when we talk about within day calorie content, people who book in their calories on either end of the day, and then they have a large gap in the middle where they're not eating, you get into a severe catabolic state. So you start having the repercussions, as I was talking earlier. The longer you stay in a breakdown state without food, the more signaling you have of downturning resting metabolic rate. So even if you eat an adequate amount of calories in a 24-hour period, but they're not timed well, you can still get into this misstep which causes your body to start conserving and putting on body fat. When we look at intermittent fasting and we're looking at the health aspects of intermittent fasting, where people are like, oh yeah, I'm reading all this longevity data, it helps with telomere length, it helps with body composition, it helps with mental clarity. That's all data from men. When we look at the data for women, it's different. we don't get the same autophagy. We don't get brain clarity. We end up with higher triglycerides. We end up with less glucose tolerance and more insulin resistance. And all of these perpetuate body fat gain. If we want to garner some of the longevity benefits, you're looking at not eating after dinner and then having breakfast. And that is what typically is normal eating. People forget how to eat normally, especially in this day and age where everything is 24/7. So when we're talking about female athletes and they're really hardcore, I need to do intermittent fasting. I've read so much about it. I really want to give it a go. It's always not, if you're going to do intermittent fasting, it's just 12 hours overnight. That's enough to give you some of the longevity and some of the metabolic benefits. But if you extend it to 16, like you wake up and you go training, or you get up and you don't have breakfast within that hour of getting up, your cortisol levels are spiking and you're getting that signaling to store body fat and reduce your rest metabolic rate. And so again, being very conscious of where the data is coming from these diet trends. The keto diet from male athletes. It started in a clinical setting where obese, diabetic, or cardiovascular patients were all men and they needed to lose weight quickly. When we look at the low carb, high fat, that came on as metabolic efficiency to increase our body's ability to burn fat during exercise. Women are already at their maximum fatty acid capacity because of these sex differences I talked about earlier. So again, it causes more negative issues than it does positive issues. And the same goes with the intermittent fasting and fasting dieting or fasted training. All of the data is primarily from men, and the small amounts that are from women get washed out in the male data until you can really pinpoint a couple of key ones that are coming out. Louise Burke has done some work at AIS looking at the low carb, high fat diet on performance and body composition. It doesn't work, especially in women.
I want to talk a little bit about too the cortisol. So you had just mentioned, it's going to trigger our cortisol levels, and I would argue that we're in a pretty high stress job. I mean, it's a high stress world anyway, but very high stress job. We add on to that bad advice, intermittent fasting and all that kind of stuff, or rather not intermittent fasting, but maybe fasting before and after your workouts. We tend to cut a lot of calories, especially if we have to make a weigh-in, we'll cut a bunch of calories, we'll do a really high intensity workout, and we start to have a lot of issues. I know that you've mentioned before low energy availability, but then also I would like to kind of talk a little bit about stress too. I don't know if you want to hit both of those.
Stress, we talk about stress, right? And we think about it as daily stress. And then we also have to remember that exercise is a stress as well. And it impacts sleep, it impacts body composition, it impacts anxiety, all of these things. And as women get older, especially in their late 30s, early 40s, our resting cortisol levels come up anyway. So when we're talking about cortisol, we want to do anything and everything possible to dampen it down. So we know that taking protein at regular intervals helps bring it down. Parasympathetic activation is super important. Now, I know that if I were to say mindfulness training to a bunch of older white male military officers, they would probably look at me and think that I was a little dumb blonde Barbie. But when I talk about mindfulness, I'm not talking about the yoga Zen stuff. I'm talking about taking 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes if you have the time to sit down, and you might feel a breeze, right? So you're sitting down under a tree in the shade and you're feeling the breeze. You're just concentrating on how that breeze feels against your skin. So you're just concentrating on one point. Or at night, like before you go to bed, you're sitting for 5 to 10 minutes in a quiet room and you're taking deep breaths. So you're concentrating on what does it mean to have a full inhale and a full exhale. That is a little yogi, but all of it is just focusing on one little point and how you feel to get that deep relaxation, be able to hold on to that. So when you get into a stressed state, like you can't sleep or you're short sleep or night mission, you just go back to that one trigger of breeze. How does it feel? And it starts to counter some of the really high stress. We don't spend enough time activating our parasympathetic system. We also know that in the high hormone phase, we have a really difficult time activating the parasympathetic system. We're always in a sympathetic drive. So any small amount of time that you can spend just a couple of minutes here, a couple of minutes there, focusing on one thing, I know I do it because I get road rage. I mean, driving around the 395 in DC so many times, I'm like, oh, right? Back to back traffic. So I would get to a point where I get so wound up. And that's where I really started practicing the deep breath in. What does the air conditioning feel like? That's one small little thing that I could really trigger back to activate that parasympathetic. And it's so critical for women to have that one ability to turn back and say, I need just to chill out for a minute, bring my cortisol levels down. How do I do that? And it takes a little bit to really be able to immediately go back to that place and time of relaxation. But it's so worth it because you can use it at so many different points throughout your day to offload that cortisol and start to instigate that more parasympathetic response.
I've even heard too and read about some things in medical journals too about how stress, like high stress especially, can start to age us prematurely, really. And so start to kick us into some of those perimenopause and menopause states, which I
Yes.
know no one would ever think we're going to talk perimenopause and menopause here with a bunch of Marines, but it's really critical because what we're trying to do is set the conditions for women to stay on active duty as long as possible. And our service chief, our commandant, has said, why aren't women staying on to become lieutenant colonels and general officers? And some of this could be they don't really know how to respond to their changing physiology. So could you talk a little bit about the perimenopause? Like, what should we be expecting? Because I think a lot of times women are going into it a little earlier. So in their maybe early to mid 30s, which is their civilian counterparts are probably hitting it at 40.
Yep.
So we could be
Yeah.
hitting pretty early.
Yeah, I appreciate that the conversations around perimenopause are starting to come out because it has been taboo for so long. And I kind of laugh about it where when we talk about menopause and we see a picture of like an aging male who's like all buff in his little Speedo, right? But then you see the equivalent of a woman and she's like all sweatered up in dowager hump and looks really frail.
Yeah.
And that's that portrayal. Um, so when we back it up and say, okay, well, what exactly is happening? Why are we getting these different mixed signals? Because men age at a consistent, but women have this one point in time where boom, all these changes happen right away. And our body composition changes, our risk factors for so many public burden diseases like diabetes, metabolic syndrome, that kind of stuff suddenly skyrocket. And so people are like, oh my gosh, there's a certain point where you come squishy overnight. So if we look and see what's happening, and perimenopause is that time. It can be early 30s up to 50, where your hormones are shifting. You're preparing, or your body's preparing not to be in a reproductive state. You might have a regular period. You might not notice changes from a menstrual cycle point of view, but the ratios of your hormones are changing. Your estrogen starts to come up a little bit more. A lot of women become estrogen dominant. So with that estrogen dominance, we have more inflammation. We have poorer recovery. We have poorer sleep. And the way we really see it is a lot of women will wake up and feel like they became quote squishy overnight, where they've lost their lean mass and put on a lot of body fat. And no one talks about it. And they're like, what's going on? And the almost automatic response is, I'm not training hard enough and I'm eating too much, which is counterproductive again. So the conversation around perimenopause is one that is still taboo and needs to come out. So it is, these hormones are changing. Our body is responding because these hormones have such an effect on every system of the body, where it's responsible for lean mass development. It's responsible for decreased inflammation. It's responsible for brain clarity and reaction time. But when those hormones start to change in the ratios and flatline, we have to find something that is an alternative to that so that our body keeps responding. So this is where we look to nutrition and training changes. So when our hormones are starting to flatline and we have more estrogen dominance, we need to look at doing more high intensity, like that polarized top end, high, hard stuff. And recovery is very, very low. If I'm talking about high intensity interval training, I'm not talking about a class or session that you can do for an hour. I'm talking about you have a warm up for 5 to 10 minutes, and that high intensity might be 10 minutes because you're completely gassed by the end of it. It's not these typical, classes or F45s or anything like that. It is that high intensity, 20 seconds, full gas, and you're having 80-second recovery of very low intensity. We also have to look at plyometrics, so the jump training, because that does a couple of things. One, with the high impact and the power and explosion of plyometric work, we get better insulin control, glucose control. Our bodies learn to pull carbohydrate into the muscle, not using insulin, so it activates more of our GLUT4 mechanisms, protein that pulls carbohydrate in without having to use insulin. It also helps with bone mass. So we know that running is not good enough for maintaining bone mass, and that is a significant issue when we start hitting that peri and postmenopausal state, where we start losing bone mass at a rapid rate. We start seeing that as stress reactions in a lot of female athletes, stress fractures, on the low end of bone density. And if you've had eating issues across the way and low energy availability across the way, you're already going to be in that lower range. So we need jump training, multi-directional stress to get that bone density up. And we also have to think about lifting heavy shit. We have to lift heavy. And I'm not talking 8 to 12 reps, body weight work, not that. We're not looking at the hypertrophy. We're looking at neuromuscular activation and recruiting as many fibers as we can in one contraction to lift. And when we start looking at short, sharp stuff, lifting heavy, then we see really positive body composition changes and being able to mitigate these effects of the hormone fluctuations. And when you start doing that, you have injury prevention, better body composition, ability to control that visceral fat gain or the menopause, where you start putting more belly fat on. And it carries you through into postmenopause, into the next biological state. What I want everyone to understand is menopause itself is just one point on the calendar that marks 12 months of no period. So I'm laughingly telling everyone you should have a menopause birthday when you reach it, because it's just one point on the calendar. Then it's postmenopause, and before that is perimenopause. So menopause in itself is just one day. So when you're thinking about one day, but when you're thinking about, okay, what am I doing leading up to that one day and then carrying me through, changing up that training? It's not the long stuff, it's sharp, high intensity work coupled with really fantastic nutrition to match it, and away you go.
Wow, that I'm sure that just blew everyone's mind that's listening in. So I'm sorry. Let me talk a little bit more about, or ask you a little bit more about the symptoms of perimenopause. So oftentimes, I've even talked to my own doctor and said, well, what do you think? I'm starting to experience all these crazy changes that I'm not familiar with. I'm like, I can't remember somebody's name. I start to play charades as I'm describing an object, because I've lost the words to say something. Stress, I'm waking up in the middle of the night, at 2 a.m., between 2 and 4 a.m. For women that are starting to experience that, that's usually typically signs of perimenopause, correct? And they might start to experience those in their 30s. Is there anything that they can do besides the training? I know you talked a little bit about adaptogens and how that might help.
Yeah, so adaptogens are very interesting because they have a lot of NIH support. And the fact that they've been peer reviewed, there's lots of evidence for the efficacy. And basically what they are, they're compounds within certain plants. So we know Indian ginseng is a common word. We know maca, not McDonald's, which I've gotten, but maca as in plant, ashwagandha, shishandra, all of these are sort of foreign words. They've been around for ages. And the compounds in these plants, they work with your cortisol and hormonal responses to help attenuate weird changes. So if you're having brain fog, you're having night sweats, you're having vasomotor symptoms, it has to do really with the change of the ratios of the hormones and a sudden response from the endocrine system saying, hey, wait a second, something's wrong. So if you're using adaptogens, it just really flatlines the very big switches and shifts. So if you're having brain fog, which is that, blank of, I don't remember where I'm going, I can't find my keys. Oh, right, they're right in front of me kind of thing, right? And you can't sleep at night. Then you look at using more of like shishandra, which is more of a stimulant, so that you can get that cognitive focus and you understand, because it's supporting neurotransmitter activation and the way that your brain works. It's not a pharmaceutical agent. It's not like going on antidepressants. It's not anything that is harmful to the body because it supports your body systems. Um, and if we're looking at, having problems sleeping at night, then we start looking at more of the relaxation, the parasympathetic drivers. So we're looking at rhodiola, we're looking at holy basil. And there are certain mushrooms that you can use as well that are all coming out with really fantastic, robust peer review evidence to show that they work well. And I always work with female athletes across the age span. You can start in puberty when girls are having all these hormone fluctuations, when their periods are first starting, and they end up with bad skin and poor sleep and body composition change, getting them on ashwagandha, which really helps mitigate estrogen flux, levels it so their skin gets better. They don't have severe body composition change. They don't have a lot of anxiety. So now we don't have to look at them going on an oral contraceptive pill or something else. When we get to the other end of the spectrum of the perimenopause, it's very similar in the fact that your hormones are all over the show and it's really hard to track. So just taking in these plant compounds to support those hormone mechanisms really helps level these shifts and these swings that happen so often.
So you mentioned going on to hormonal birth control, because oftentimes that is usually what somebody will, a doctor might prescribe that, or even at a young age, that's what you're usually given as just a way of mitigating some of the symptoms. I know you speak at length about hormonal birth control, and I'm hoping maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah. In fact, someone sent me a paper this morning talking about how HC doesn't have any effect on performance, and I'm reading the methods and I'm getting really angry because the methods aren't done well. But that's a side tangent because it still comes up. There's so much stuff where people are trying to show that OCs and hormonal contraception don't have an effect, but we know that they do. So one of the most prescribed is what we call monophasic. So it's 3 weeks of an active pill, the same estrogen progesterone dose, and then a sugar pill week. So if we think about what's happening when you take that pill, you have one dose in the morning of estrogen progesterone, and the half-life of that hormone changes. So the level that you would have at night is different from what you would have in the morning. So you have these little blips, these little spiky blips for 3 weeks. But not only that, these are higher blips than what your natural hormones are. These pills also downregulate your natural hormone cycle. So you don't produce estrogen, progesterone. You don't have a luteinizing hormone surge. You don't ovulate. That's a mechanism of action. So then when you get to the sugar pill week, people are like, I have a period, I bleed, but it's not a true period. It's just representing the fact that these hormones are no longer controlling your system. It's a withdrawal bleed. So if you are being put on an OC because you are amenorrheic, you don't have a period, or you have very irregular periods, you have PCOS, or you have other issues with skin and stuff, that's not the right medical advice to go to. And I get very frustrated with GPs who put young girls on it, or a woman comes and says, I haven't had a period in 2 or 3 years. Oh, you need to go on the pill to get a period, because it's not a period. It's not fixing the problem. We look at hormonal contraception from a performance standpoint as well. We know that OCs have a direct effect on so many of the systems of our body because they are higher biological state of estrogen, progesterone. Of course, they affect our systems. We know that the heart rate variability and response to exercise and adaptation is pretty flatlined and blunted during the 3 weeks of the active pill. On either end of it, when you first start the active pill, it looks like you have a really fantastic recovery because your heart rate variability is elevated, your sleep is better, and then 3 or 4 days into taking the pill, it comes down in flatlines. We know that an equivalent stress or strain score of someone on a pill versus not on a pill, the stress and strain is way higher, lasts longer than someone who's on a pill. Inflammation, total body inflammation is higher on people who are on a pill. Oxidation rate higher for people who are on a pill. When we're looking at top end anaerobic capacity, that sprint cognitive reaction time, those are blunted for people who are on the combined oral contraceptive pill. Alternatives to it for true contraception, especially for members in the service who are looking at not having a period on missions or not getting pregnant, is really looking at the IUD. So we have a copper IUD, we have some that has a small amount of progestin. So what the IUD does is it is the most effective means of contraception. It's on WHO's list of 200 essential medications because it is so effective as a contraception. But it does not downregulate your natural hormones. You still have a fluctuation, but you don't have a period bleed because you have a little bit of autophagy that happens with the uterine lining. So what I mean by that is when you have the low dose progestin from the Mirena, you don't have as much of a stimulation to build a lot of the uterine lining. It also reduces the signaling to build that uterine lining so that when you come to the point where your natural estrogen progesterone drop, it's not a significant signal to shed all of it because your body's like, these are cells I don't really need, so I'm just going to uptake it. And that happens about 3 or 4 months after you're on an IUD. The first couple of months, you might have a little bit of bleeding, but after that, a lot of women don't. And you still ovulate on an IUD as well. So you can track your cycle through BBT, which is your basal body temperature. So you can use period tracking apps. And so you can train according to your cycle. And it doesn't mask anything. It doesn't have any reproductive harm, not that OCs do. But when you're looking at what is the bottom line for people going on contraception, we have to get the GPs and other people to understand that is not a pill to fix a problem with the reproductive system. It masks the problem. And if we want a contraception that works, we need to look at something that doesn't really interfere so much with our endocrine system, because the endocrine system is so essential at telling us that we are healthy. Because when you start having missteps in your period and in your menstrual cycle, then it's a sign that your endocrine system is not healthy. So you're not going to maximize training. You're not going to be resilient in how your body responds to stress.
Yeah. It's so often that I would hear Marines go on to like a contraception right before a deployment or even some of their training. I mean, I even remember when I first came into the Marine Corps, my recruiter told me, you should probably, a lot of women go on the pill right before so they don't have to have a cycle while they're at officer candidate school. And I still can't believe that some people would take that advice, but it is really important because it is a signal of what's truly going on in your body. Thank you for explaining that. I want to, before I go to questions, for some of our women that are really staying on active duty a lot longer and they're past menopause, so they're post menopause, any advice or thoughts that you can give them?
With staying active and fit and injury free and all that kind of stuff, it's really looking at the type of training that you are doing. So it's the short stuff. It's not the long stuff. Even if you are saying, oh, I've got a 24-hour session where I have to be on my feet for 24 hours, your body's already primed for long endurance stuff. We lose that fast twitch. We lose the power production. So focusing your training on the power production and the fast twitch and the strength, those are very critical for injury prevention, for maintaining small things like good posture, pelvic floor health, all of these things that start to have a downturn with menopause. Sorry, I should say postmenopause, not the one day on the calendar, postmenopause. And then from a nutrition standpoint, put an emphasis on protein. So it's protein doses throughout the day and a really good protein hit right after training so that your body can get the signaling to put on lean mass and lose body fat, keep the serial body fat down. And then when we're thinking about the carbohydrate aspect, it's eating as many colorful fruits and veggies as you can to maintain a healthy gut microbiome. That's the ideal scenario. When you're out on deployment and you're going on, these are the only things I have, you do as best as you can, knowing that it's most likely a temporary blip in time. It can be a time of 3 months to 3 years, but it is a temporary blip in the entire time that you're doing this. You just do the best that you can. You focus on the training part, and then the nutrition part, you're really trying to do what you can with what you have, knowing that the ideal is really good, high quality protein and fruit and veg carbohydrate.
Thank you. That was awesome. Actually, I have two final questions before we open it up to questions. What advice would you give yourself if you were, 20 years younger? What would you, now that you know so much?
First, I would go back and tell myself that I need to get a period because I didn't start my period until I was in my 20s. And that was being a runner. I went to a very old military doctor who had my mother in the room, talked to my mother, and told me I had to go on a pill and didn't ask me what I wanted to do. So I didn't. So I would go back to my younger self and say, drop the high mileage, eat more. You want to have good body composition. You want to lean up. You want to be fit. You want to be fast. You want longevity. Drop the high mileage, eat more, get in the gym, get your period. And then when it finally came and I had put on a little bit more weight, I started freaking out. And I wish I could go back to that point in time and say, it's normal. And these are the things you can do to reduce the body fat and maintain a period. Because those conversations weren't around. They were never around. And so now they're starting to be okay to have, even with teammates back in the day. We didn't talk about periods. It was still taboo, right? When I was on the crew team and we're talking about periods, people are like, yeah, I'm a few days out, I'm a bit crabby today. Aunt Flo's coming. So just really trying to push to have those conversations to be able to say, it's okay. Every woman has a period, because if we didn't, we wouldn't have humankind. There would be no people left, because the menstrual cycle is essential for reproduction, but we have to work with it, and we can.
Right. What advice would you, so we women make up 9% of the Marine Corps, and we're the smallest force, the least amount of women. So a lot of our male leaders are in charge of training and all of that kind of stuff. So what advice would you give them, or if you could say one thing to them, or several things?
Oh yeah, several. Behind closed doors or in an open forum?
Well, I guess to optimize, to really think about all of their Marines. So like you said, I mean, part of what got you so curious about female performance is because a lot of our data was just getting tossed out, which is crazy. But that's same, just because there's not a lot of information about who we are and our physiology, except for your work, they don't know either.
Yeah, I know. There was a article that's published from a survey of high performance coaches with the Australian Institute of Sport of what they wanted to know. And most of them didn't even know what the menstrual cycle was. So just basic education, right? So they need to know what the menstrual cycle is. And then they would like to know how to change training to help their athletes. So I always look and go, if I were to talk to my dad's friends who are still in the military at some points, how would I approach this conversation? And I would always say, do you have a daughter? Do you have a wife? Do you have a sister? And most of them will say yes. And I'm like, okay, well, for your daughter, do you want her to achieve her performance potential? Do you want her to remain injury-free? Yeah. Have you asked her about her menstrual cycle? Red face. Most of them don't. I'm like, well, if you don't know if she has a menstrual cycle or not, you don't know if she's healthy. If she's not healthy, she's not going to achieve her performance potential. I leave it there. And then most of them start thinking and churning and going, oh, wait a second. Because when you bring it home to the daughter, the sister, the mother, or some other female that's close to them in their life, and they want the best for that female, it really gets them thinking. So when we think about upper management in military who want to have the best for their Marines, and you go, okay, well, you have this small cohort of very fantastic, fit, motivated women, and you want them to be the best and achieve their performance potential. If I could offer you one thing that unlocks that potential, would you take it? And most people would say yes. I'm like, that is the conversation around the menstrual cycle, the education around the menstrual cycle, understanding it, tracking it, knowing how to use it to their advantage.
That's great. That's great advice. I'm sorry, I do have one last one. I said final, but if an athlete came to you looking for help, I want to increase my performance, I want to do better, especially as they're getting a little older, and then they said, but I also want to fit into a certain weight category, or I want to weigh a certain amount. What's your advice?
Those are all my MMA athletes, all my mixed martial arts athletes, right? And they have to lean up and fit into a weight category for their major fights. And most of them are low energy availability. So I first start with looking at, okay, are you eating enough for just basic function? And most of them are between 800 and 1,000 calories down in a day. And most are going to be like, I'm not eating that much because I'm going to put weight on. So we really just take it out of the equation and talk about the training. So first we're like, okay, do you track your menstrual cycle? Yep, or I'm on an oral contraceptive pill, or I'm on an IUD. So finding out about the reproductive aspect of what they're doing. And then we overlay the training and fuel for the training. So when we're fueling for the training according to what they're doing, and then laying the training according to menstrual cycle, they start to lean up and lose weight. And there are some that don't. And so we really look at where we're going to impact some calorie restriction and boost the protein so that you do respond and lose body fat in time for your event. And so it is more that individualistic approach, because there isn't one size fits all, unfortunately. But the basic guidelines are looking at menstrual cycle or contraception. What are you using? Trying to overlay training on that, and definitely fueling for what you are doing. If you feel like you, or not feel like, if you know you need to lose some weight along the way, again, it's taking it away from the training and nutrition stress and looking in the afternoon away from training and reducing the carbohydrate, increasing the protein. That increased protein helps increase metabolic rate, but it also helps significantly with repair while you are sleeping. So it's higher protein intake across the board and fueling for what you are doing.
Great. Okay, let's open up to questions. Carrie, go ahead. No, you're gonna have to come off mute, Carrie. There you
Okay.
go.
Hi, ma'am.
Hi,
Hey, Dr. Sims. I'm so happy that you were able to join us tonight, and thank you so much for offering your time to talk to us about this topic.
Yeah.
You state that a lot of research is only based on men. Broadening that to other categories, such as lab results for blood work.
Yep.
Oftentimes what happens with us or in the military, in the Marine Corps especially, is if you don't make your weight and you're not able to tape and get an acceptable estimation of body fat, the first thing that they do is they send you to medical to get your blood drawn. And depending on how much your doctor knows about lab work, because we have the gamut of cardiologists that come and are doctors, but there are also pathologists that come and are doctors. So again, just the gamut is it runs the entire gamut. So what would your recommendations be of, one, within our menstrual cycle, if we were to get the lab work done, what would be the best time to get the best estimate or assessment of where we really stand when it comes to those results when they run like our thyroid test and those other standard metabolic tests?
Yeah, so the first question would be, if you have a regular menstrual cycle, we usually try to get all of your blood work done around day 21, because then we can see if you have adequate progesterone and if you have ovulatory cycles, because this will inform endocrine health. If your periods are super duper irregular, then you go in and you have blood work done. And regardless of what phase you're in, it'll show you what is irregular, because they'll give you a comparison between what estrogen is supposed to be in low hormone, ovulatory, and high hormone phases. A lot of women who have really irregular cycles don't have a luteinizing hormone surge. That's kind of hard to pinpoint, but you can see that by low progesterone and low estrogen. Some women range right at the bottom of the end of normal, almost in a postmenopausal state, even though they still might bleed on occasion, and that's something to bring up. So if you have a regular cycle and you can pinpoint day 21, that's when you want to do most of your, well, not when you want to do most of, that's when you want to get your bloods done. If you're irregular, then get it and then have the comparison of the range, so you can understand it and inform. Most of the time you'll have to inform your own physician about it because they don't know much about it. I've had to go to bat for myself and quite a few people when I get it, oh, it's normal. And I look at them like, this is not normal. These are not normal. It's on the very low end of things. And I know as a female athlete, it's not normal. So yeah, you kind of have to be empowered with education to go back and punch back.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was actually fantastic because that is one of our standard tests, and we never have linked it up to any part of our cycle. What other questions do we have? Patty, go for it.
Wow, this is amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Sims, for being here and super timely. I ironically have my GYN appointment tomorrow. So I feel like I'm armed with some great questions.
Good.
But one of the questions I have, and this was brought up by the Air Force physiologist, I guess, however you say that, but he was talking about supplements during trainings like boot camp. You know, I'm retired Coast Guard, so for members going through our swimmer school, which is our elite, you know, jumping out of the helicopter swimmers. So what are your take on on supplements? I know you mentioned some of the plant stuff that is the adaptogens, I think that you mentioned, but what about like iron supplements? Because I thought there might be some research on that, magnesium, any other supplements you recommend?
Yeah, so iron is interesting because if you have a chronic inflammatory state, you're not going to absorb iron. So you take a supplement, it doesn't work. What counters it is vitamin D. So we look, and the reason why inflammation drives this enzyme called hepcidin up. And when hepcidin is up, you can't absorb iron from the gut. So a lot of women will fluctuate on this low iron, low ferritin or low iron stores, and they'll take a supplement and it doesn't boost it because no one's addressed the inflammation. So we look at taking vitamin D3. So Peter Peeling, P-E-E-L-I-N-G, has done quite a bit of work on this, looking at hepcidin responses, vitamin D responses in female athletes to mitigate that inflammation to help with iron absorption. And when we think about magnesium, yes, it's low in a lot of Western diets and stuff, but why are we taking magnesium? Is it for sleep? Is it for cramping? So that's the question. We know that it might be linked to cramping if you have too much calcium, not enough magnesium. And the way to figure it out is if you are prone to cramping during activity, you take a Tums, a calcium carbonate. And if Tums helps, then you know that it's not a magnesium thing. It's you're excreting too much calcium while you're exercising. If you're having issues sleeping, magnesium does help with sleep, but also know that is used as a laxative. So you want to take smaller doses. I recommend magnesium, zinc, and omega-3s the week before your period starts, because all of those affect different parts of the inflammatory response to reduce PMS and reduce the severity of bleeding. And your body uses a lot of magnesium and zinc to build the uterine lining. So from a physiological perspective of using supplements, yeah, you have to know exactly what you're using it for, but a hit out for sport supplementation, like you really don't need to think about taking salt tablets, iron, magnesium, selenium. It's really what am I doing? I need branched chain amino acids for central nervous system fatigue. I didn't get a lot of sleep. I'm in the high hormone phase. I have a hard PT session or a PT test of sorts. I need to take some branched chains. Whey protein, especially whey protein isolate, really beneficial because it is a very fast hit of high quality protein and leucine. It also helps reduce inflammation post-exercise. So again, that feeds forward into helping with iron absorption. And then when you hear about like bicarbonate and creatine, that data is primarily on men. The only efficacy for creatine is for concussion. So post-concussion syndrome is very prevalent, especially in women. It lasts longer, especially if you get hit in the high hormone phase. But using creatine helps with brain health and recovering. It's not about the muscle aspect from a sports point of view, but about brain health. We could spend another whole hour on supplements.
I was thinking, and actually, when Stacy, when you and I, or Dr. Sims, when you and I were speaking before this call, we had talked a little bit about concussions and actually how women respond differently. I don't know if you want to just touch on that, because I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, so concussions are interesting, traumatic brain injury. And if a woman is hit in the high hormone phase, the recovery is longer and the acute part of the recovery is longer. And that post-concussive syndrome, which is that deadened fatigue in the late afternoon where no matter what you do, you can't stay awake, that lingers for a lot longer. It can be 6 months to a year in women. And then all the recommendations from a return to play and a nutrition scope is based on men, of course. So we know that our symptomology is different. If we get hit in the high hormone phase, we have to look at changing our diets to increase the amount of BDNF that's produced from the gut. So BDNF is brain neurotrophic factor that increases brain health and repairs brain tissue. So it's the concussion thing is very interesting because a lot of women will get hit, and depending also where you get hit, you might end up with menstrual cycle irregularities. And these are things that aren't talked about. So if you've had a concussion and you're like, what's going on? I'm having post-concussion syndrome, or I'm having lots of fatigue, my period is irregular, what's going, and all of these things start to add up and it causes a lot of stress. It's related to the concussion. And you can look at doing specific things to increase that BDNF, to increase brain health. That's starting to come out a little bit. One of my PhD students is doing a lot of investigation on collision sports and concussion from collision sports under severe fatigue. And she has come up with a list of all of these things that women should be using if they get hit in the high hormone phase. And creatine is one of the most powerful things that you can use to increase brain function and reduce concussive symptoms.
Thank you. Fascinating. Audrey, I think you have a question. You're not to come off mute.
I do. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I have a deep suspicion of my own cortisol level, shall we say? Okay. So, but that is not my question. Two questions. Maybe one is easier than the other. The first is there still value in tracking your cycle if you are on hormonal birth control? As a lady who is on it and has been on it for a long time, yep. I'm interested in knowing that. I will also say that our providers, my experience with our providers is that they lack education in what is high hormone, what is low hormone, because they just don't treat a lot of women. And so the last time that I was in, I sort of said like, hey, I've been on the same birth control pill for 5 years and I would love to know if this is the right one for me. And my provider was like, do you want to change? And I was like, I don't know. Do I want to change? Right. It was like, who's on first? And I ended up changing because I was on a triphasic and realized that I probably didn't need to take myself through a hormone cycle every month if I didn't want a period every month. So I'm on a monophasic, but yeah, that's kind of question one. And then maybe you talked a little bit about high intensity training. And so I do a lot of heart rate training and monitoring based off my heart rate. And so I was curious if there was also connections to kind of how quickly your ability to recover in heart rate training is for that high intensity. I noticed that I spike really high, really fast. Yep. Like when I'm running at a casual pace, I will go into what I would consider to be the red zone and stay there, but come out of it, within 60 seconds. So I would just be curious kind of if there's the same kind of connection across the menstrual cycle for that as well. Sorry, that was kind of really related.
It is beneficial to track. So it's not going to be tracking like you would with the natural cycle, but knowing what your body's doing in the first 2 to 3 days of the active pill and what is definitely happening during the sugar pill week, because this is where you have a rebound and your body's own hormones have a little bit of interplay. Now with the heart rate spike, you also want to know where you are on the active pill cycle, because we know from some recent data that in the first few days of taking the pill, you have more resilience in heart rate capacity. So your heart rate reserve is different, your heart rate variability is different, but the more you get into that steady hormone profile, the less resilience you have. So your heart rate will spike, your resting heart rate is higher, and your respiratory rate is higher. So if you're tracking across what your pill phase is, you can start to get an idea of the patterning. It's more for you to understand so you don't freak out about things. It's not so much that you can really manipulate your training, because there's only a few days on either side of the active pill and during the sugar pill week where you can say, okay, I see what's going on. I can hit it hard on these days, or I need to recover a little bit.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Jeannie, go for it.
Yes, Dr. Sims, thank you again for being here with us. I have two main questions. So I personally, right now, I work with Marines that are in the BCP program, which is the body composition program. And my main kind of like concerns or question is, whenever you're approaching, especially like female Marines, what questions can you begin asking them in order for us to be able to fix their overweight? Well, I don't want to say overweight because sometimes, our standards are very, very strict. But yeah, being able to work with them for them to go back into standards, as well as like workout regimens, or kind of like how like their eating habits. What would you recommend, especially like, I know the Marine Corps gives us about like 6 months or so for us to get back on standards. So what would you advise?
Some of the things that I always want to know about people when looking at changing body composition is more their habits, because if you say, can you keep a food record? People won't be truthful. They think you're judging. But if you talk about like the timing of food, how is your sleep, understanding, where they get the most of their calories during the day, are they doing fasted training, getting that really good understanding of their habits, then you can say, okay, well, we know that fasted training isn't good. We know that you need to fuel in and around your training. So you can start just small little changes that make a significant difference. And then the other question that becomes a little bit deeper, again, is ask about menstrual cycle health. And if they have really irregular cycles or they've stopped, then you know that they're not fueling for anything really. There's an undercurrent of an eating disorder or low energy availability. And before we can make any inroads in body composition change, you need to get them on the page of understanding that having your period is an ergogenic aid. So again, it always comes back to the bottom line of health, taking the focus away from the body composition. Because when you understand where they are from a mindset and how they're patterning their food or not patterning their food, you can make small steps to have really fantastic inroads to make them feel better. Because a lot of people who are trying to lose body fat feel not so great about themselves, especially if they have to hit standards or have to hit a weight. And so exercise becomes a chore, and trying to hit different metrics of intensity becomes a chore, where if they're fueling for it, they're going to feel good about it. And it's a feed forward. If you feel good while you're training, you're going to want to do it again and again and again and again. So again, it's just the small little manipulations across the board to make sure that when they're coming in or what they're doing, they're really well fueled so that they don't get negative feedback during the training session. And then the body composition kind of follows along with that really fantastic training session.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was on mute. Stephanie, Simon, sorry. I'm like, Steph, can you hear us? Go for it. Sorry.
Hello. Good evening, Dr. Sims. Thank you for your time. My name is First Lieutenant Simon. I'm currently with a high performance boxing program on the Marine Corps boxing team. And we're kind of in a weird position right now where this is the first time we've ever done like a co-ed combat sports team like this. So a lot of considerations aren't being made for women. It's pretty much all for men. At this point, we have, officer in charge, master sergeant, athletic trainers, everybody, they're all men, and none of the advice they give us really caters to the women whatsoever. So calorie intake, I've raised my hands a couple times, asking like, is it the same for men and women? And it kind of just gave like this like nod as if we're all gonna have the same exact baseline calories and everything. So I was wondering, do you have any advice for approaching, athletic trainers and coaches and people that have been doing, their job for 30 years, who think they know everything, who kind of don't know everything? Like, what would you suggest coming, from someone who's not, I'm not a professional in any sense in terms of like the science behind it, but I'm not quite sure how to approach them and say, hey, like we have a different situation here for the women on the team.
Yeah, it's really hard, especially if you're looking at someone who's been in that male situation and used to telling people what to do. So it's more of the approachment of I'm just interested. Like, I know that I'm a smaller person and there are, differences between men and women, and I want to fuel appropriately. So what kind of protein should I be getting? If they can't answer, you'd be like, well, do you have any resources? So it's more not necessarily being attacking, or it's just having that conversation or asking a question from a knowledge base, because they're very eager to share knowledge for the most part. There are individuals who aren't. But when you're approaching it from I'm just interested to know more to help me as an individual, then they're more often to be open about conversations. If you can't get any information from them and you need to empower yourself, ping me, I'll help you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries.
Catherine, you have a question.
Yes. Hey, ma'am. Hey, Dr. Sims. Thank you so much for doing this. It's all very interesting. I had a specific question. I wanted to talk about overtraining. Are there any specific signs or specific formula for women who have that stubborn body fat, and basically they just push to do more and more workouts, and thus might be either increasing their cortisol levels without knowing it, or putting themselves more on that plateau or that downward spiral? Basically, how do you know when to cut off the hour-long treadmill or spin classes and do more of the HIIT training that you're referring to? What's a good way to recognize in yourself if you're overtraining?
So overtraining is interesting because you do want to get to some point, like the overreach and then pull back, but a lot of women just keep going and going and going and going and going. So if you wake up in a dead end fatigue, like it doesn't matter how much sleep you had, and you're just like, I am dead to the world and all I want to do is sleep, then you know that you are in that overtraining state. When you are not quite sure and you go to the gym or you go to a spin class and you're having a hard time spiking your heart rate, getting your heart rate up high, you're having a hard time hitting power numbers, can't lift as much as you normally do, then you're overtrained. Because your body is like, I can't hit that high intensity, I'm in a conservation. Treadmill as well. So if you're doing your running and your running speed, the economy of movement is down. What I mean by that is you're used to running at 8 miles per hour and all of a sudden you're at your max heart rate at that speed and you're like, what's going on? You're overtrained. You need to take a break. And the kind of the way to really scope it is looking at putting in some deload days or some not recovery days, but technique days. And if you're looking at these 2 or 3 days of technique work and you're just getting more and more tired, then that is a sign that you really need to back it down, you're overtrained. And then the most telling sign of it all, aside from the dead end fatigue, is stubborn belly fat that just won't go away, because that is the fat that stays the most with high cortisol and just being in that sympathetic drive all of the time.
I know you spoke on centering yourself 10 minutes a day, 5 minutes a day. If you do that regularly with yoga and you still just have the stubborn body fat, you're lifting weights, you're spinning, you're doing the running, you're mixing it up. Is there any kind of blood work that you can do to see, do I have a cortisol problem? Do I have any other kind of it's not an issue with your training? Like, how do you know if there's an underlying issue with the hormones or anything like that, vice, what you're doing physically training wise, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you can get baseline cortisol and THS, which is your thyroid function. So if you're looking for cortisol and looking for spikes in it, you get it at 7 a.m. or 4 p.m. And this gives you an adequate, like a really good indication of what's happening with cortisol. So you want to get it at the points where your cortisol peaks. And if it's a really high peak, then you know that your baseline is elevated. If it is really low, then that's another sign that there's endocrine dysfunction. So you can just start with just getting basic cortisol checked. And then if it seems normal, then you can go down the thyroid route as well. Yeah, and then like from a sleep point of view, yoga sometimes isn't the same as the mindfulness unless you're doing yin yoga, because yoga can also be very sympathetic driven from holding the postures and the poses. And if you're doing vinyasa, it's a very fast motion, even though you have the breathing. It's not the just focusing on one thing parasympathetic. So you also want to look at what kind of yoga you're doing. And like one of the faves is like heated vinyasa, and that's a super high sympathetic drive activity. Even though you're breathing and you feel really relaxed afterwards, the stress is very sympathetic.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That was great insight. Somebody, GS, I just see initials.
Hi, my apologies. My name is Jen Studer.
Hi.
Good evening. What recommendations or resources would you recommend for postpartum recovery training, particularly with pelvic floor injuries or considerations, especially if you're trying to maintain the body weight in order to breastfeed?
Yeah. Do you have access to a pelvic floor specialist?
Yes, I see her regularly.
Good, because that is the most important thing, is getting the pelvic floor health going. And then if you're looking at, you have pelvic floor control back, then you can start looking at lifting. If you have pelvic floor health and you have control of pelvic floor, you can start getting into heavy lifting without issue. And then that helps with body composition. And then breastfeeding in itself helps with body composition. If you're trying to maintain adequate nutrition to keep breastfeeding, it's about the hydration and again, the nutrition in and around that training stress. Because you can manipulate your body composition and breastfeed at the same time if you are very aware of the fact that when you are exercising and under high stress, your body also needs fuel. And if you're not eating enough for you, then your milk will dry up because your body's like, I can't produce enough milk to feed a baby if I can't even take care of the person who's producing the milk.
Thank you.
Yep.
Abigail.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sims, for doing this. I've been sitting here fangirling this whole time. I'm actually high school friends with Emily Schramm, and she's the one that introduced me to you. So this is like, my mind is blown right now that I'm actually here. My question is that one of the things in your book that just like blew my mind was the element of there is actually a thing of I'm big boned. And so my question for that is there a way for someone to know, not saying that the Marine Corps would give them a pass on the weight standards and, oh, you have big bones, okay, you're fine. But maybe just for their own psyche, their own mental health, maybe just an understanding of, hey, I have denser bones. That means, you know, I'm going to have to work on the body weight, or I have smaller bones, so I can put on a little more muscle. Is there a way for someone to know their bone composition without, you know, like elaborate university level testing?
Without getting a DEXA, you can ask to get a DEXA once a year as a female under high stress. It is part of the U.S. health system, and I'm pretty sure that the Marines have to abide by that, but you can get a DEXA every year. So that's for body comp and bone health to make sure that your bones are healthy. But aside from that, you can Google endomorph, ectomorph, mesomorph, and you can use a tape measure and figure out what kind of body shape you have. If you're like, I don't know if I'm endo, meso, or ectomorph, then there are certain calculations that used to be used across the board in early ex-phys labs, and they still stand. So it's not a sex-specific thing at all. It's just the measurement of girth of different bony points in your body to be able to tell you if you're more prone to put on body fat or muscle. So that's beneficial as well.
Thank you for that. Would you mind putting that D word in the chat so we all know how to spell it correctly?
Your DEXA? Sure.
I mean, is it as simple as it sounds? DEXA?
DEXA, yep.
Okay, well, never mind then.
Yep. Yeah, and it's like the gold standard for determining body composition as well. So if you go get a DEXA for bone density, which is recommended for women once a year to make sure that their bones are safe and strong, you don't have any kind of undercurrent of low bone density. You can also get body composition, and the benefit of that is it shows you where you're storing extra fat. So if you're storing it around the hips and thighs, even if you don't really know where you're storing it, then you know you can mobilize it quickly. If you're storing more of it deep in the abdominal cavity and it's a visceral fat, then you know you're going to have to work a little bit more to really get rid of the visceral fat. But then there's a lot of people who get a DEXA and they're like, oh, I'm fighting to lose muscle mass to get weight. So now what? Now what do I do? I don't necessarily want to lose lean mass, but I have to make weight. So it's somewhat empowering to understand how all of that works, to give you a little bit more, just another powerful tool in your toolbox of changing body composition.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Very helpful. Caroline.
So actually, I'll follow along with that. Has anybody on the call had a DEXA scan?
Sorry, I didn't hear you. What?
Has anybody on the call had a DEXA
Oh.
scan? Any of the other Marines?
That's a good question. Has anyone had a DEXA?
Well, you just blew our mind, Dr. Sims, by saying that we
Yes.
actually can rate one once a year.
Yeah, everyone's gonna call. I want my DEXA.
Oh, I'm calling right now. I'm like,
So I have a question related to that, which is, I mentioned earlier, a lot of our providers don't see a lot of women. And I am at 34, almost 35, going to see the gynecologist for the first time this month. Yeah, I have decided that I'm just going to show up. I requested a referral, and I had a very uppity day where I was like, I'm requesting a referral, and then I don't actually know what I'm going to ask when I go there. So putting together a list of questions is on my list. But is that do you feel like that DEXA question is, as a lot of us are healthy women who maybe if you're childless haven't really interacted with the medical system outside of our primary care provider once a year, casually, a PAP every 3 years, right? Is that something like an internist, a PCM, a gynecologist? Who are the providers who are the most familiar with that type of providers, that are the most familiar or thinking about those questions, that are the right people to ask that to then?
Well, I can't say most GPs, because most GPs in the States aren't that aware. You can ask your OBGYN because they are familiar with reproductive health, and when things are awry, they look at bone turnover. So they're very familiar with what a DEXA is. So if you're going and you're first time to an OB, you'd be like, I'm also really concerned about my bone mineral density. So I'd really like to get a DEXA. And if they give you pushback, you're like, no, I'm a military officer here, and I know that the US health system says that I can get a DEXA for my bone mineral density, and I really want it. So yeah, push for it.
we have a question that came in from one of our lieutenant colonels. Sorry, Lens, did you have a question?
The DEXA one just popped to me, but I actually had another question.
Okay, go for it. Sorry.
Dr. Sims, you talked a little bit earlier about deload days and technique days. Can you talk a little bit about training considerations and even nutrition considerations when you overlay those on the cycle? So when should those deload days occur based on when the hormones are spiking and then going back down?
Yeah. So the general concept is your body can handle high stress, high intensity, and the low hormones. So if we were to scope across the menstrual cycle, we would go in the follicular phase leading up to ovulation. This is where you're doing your high intensity, your heavy lifting, all the kind of high stress stuff. Around ovulation, some women feel bulletproof and some women feel super flat. And then a couple of days later, they feel bulletproof. When you feel bulletproof, that's when you go hit it hard, because your body can use the estrogen surge in and around it for recovery. So it's about the training stress on that time point. Then after ovulation, it's more steady state, not the top end stuff and not super easy, but you're looking more VO2 work, or you're looking at more 20-minute efforts if you're looking at like running or 5K efforts, that kind of stuff. And then the week before your period starts, this is the deload week, where you want to absorb the hard training from previous, and you're working on technique, you're working on running drills, economy of movement. A lot of research will say, oh, your body is compromised and tired during this point, and that's why you want to work on technique and why you want to work on reaction time when your body's compromised in that point. Because then when you get to the low hormone phase, you're on fire. So you can hit it hard again with better technique. And when you're focused on something during that deload or the recovery week, it's not in the back of your head of, I'm not being very active. You actually have a task and a point where you're like, I'm going to nail this clean. I'm going to nail my running drills. So your body is absorbing hard training while you're working on something that's not so intense.
Great, thank you. Jeannie.
Yeah.
Can you touch on nutrition with
that? Oh yeah, sorry. So your body is really good at using and accessing carbohydrate in the low hormone phase. So we're not so concerned about supplementing with carbohydrate. Protein across the board, all the phases. And then when we start to get into the high hormone phase, because progesterone is super catabolic, it becomes really important to have not only a higher amount of protein in daily diet, but the dosing of protein. So you're looking at regular intervals of protein across the day to keep amino acids circulating, to keep the signaling of that breakdown state of progesterone low. And then if you have to do high intensity during that time, you're supplementing with carbohydrate during your training to boost the amount of blood sugar, because your body's predisposed to just using body fat. Cool.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, Jeannie.
Oh no, ma'am. I was just, whenever you said the DEXA scan, I pulled out my little binder and I had one done.
Oh, nice.
I'm glad to hear that. That we
But
have some...
part of the military, it was because I do CrossFit and we're doing kind of like a slim down challenge. So, but yeah, now that I know we should be getting it for free at least once a year, definitely.
I know.
There you go.
All right, Colonel Jackson, ma'am.
Okay, hello. Thank you, Dr. Sims, for all your wonderful information. And I've just been eating up your podcast because I don't have your book yet. But I already know that I want to, and I ordered for my my two older girls who are both athletes as well. And I think just what you've done is just amazing. And I applaud your work. So you probably can't tell by the lighting, but I'm a little bit older. I've been around a while, and I think I've done everything wrong according to what you say we should be doing. And so I have.
It's not wrong. It's not wrong. It's lack of education at that point in time.
Yes, I've been ignorant then for the last probably 30 years about what I should have been doing. So I have two questions. One is, what do you recommend to sort of undo some of that harm, or do I just start fresh with, all your great advice? And then number two is, what is your favorite nutrition / protein hack for a woman of my age, say?
We probably might be the same age. So
I think maybe close. Yeah.
Yeah. So our lighting is fantastic. So yeah, just start fresh. Okay. Right? You can manipulate and change things. Your body's adaptive. It does respond really well. So it's never too late to start something new. With regard to protein, if you're looking for protein supplementation or you're looking for real food options, protein supplementation tends to be an easier way to go when you're trying to get a higher amount of protein in. You want to look for something that's clean, so you know that you're getting what is on the label. You can vet it across LabDoor, you can vet it across the WADA website, so you know that what you are consuming is actually what you want to consume. If you're looking from food sources, remember there's so many different things that have protein in it. So post-exercise, you can look at doing a single serving of Siggy's or Fage's low-fat, non-fat Greek yogurt with some almonds. And that would give you around that 30-gram mark. And then you'd want to eat a regular like sandwich or a meal or something like that to get a little bit more protein within a couple of hours post-training. So there's always, room to move with real food if you are not wanting to do just protein supplementation.
Yeah, and I, part of those 30 years has, a lot of any kind of supplement, to try to kickstart this. I will say I've been doing ashwagandha for a couple of years now, probably on and off. And that has been a difference maker. I can tell when I'm not doing it, how I feel. So I highly recommend that one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Me
Thanks
too.
again so much. All right.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Colonel Posey, ma'am.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Okay. So first off, I want to say thank you for putting this together, and thank you, Dr. Sims, for being here. I agree that the biggest challenge is education that's practical, actionable, that can make us all better. And with that said, I have a question. I was the battalion commander for 4th Recruit Training Battalion from 2017 to 2019. And during that time, there were 2 key changes that occurred not long after I got there, not because of me, it was just a coincidence that they occurred not long after I got there. And one of them was the physical training playbook. There used to be a separate playbook for male recruits and for female recruits. And the second change, and then while I was there, that merged into one gender neutral playbook. And we were very proud of that. We thought that was moving in the right direction. The other change was the 4th Recruit Training Battalion, which is where only female recruits train, and where all female enlisted Marines train and become Marines, at least previously, not anymore. We had our own chow hall, and the female recruits used to have a different diet. And while I was there, that changed, and we were very proud of that because we were on, of the mind that the female recruits were not getting enough calories. They were not getting enough calories to fuel the tremendous amount of physical activity that they participated in while we were there. So my question is, did we move in the wrong direction? Should we not have created one PT playbook? And again, just to kind of frame it, we felt, and I agreed, that the PT was dumbed down for female recruits. It wasn't challenging enough. For example, the assumption was that they couldn't do pull-ups. So instead of telling them, hey, go work on your pull-ups, the assumption was none of them could do pull-ups. So it was all a bunch of pull-up progression. So even recruits that could do pull-ups, instead of doing pull-ups, they were doing other things like band-assisted pull-ups. So my question is, do you think that female recruits should train differently than men from a physical perspective? And do you think that they should have a different diet than male recruits in the chow hall?
I don't think the diet should be different. I think that calorie accessibility is very important with the emphasis of fueling for what you're doing. I've gotten lots of questions on the differences of standards in PT for men versus women. And I don't necessarily think it's so much of a sex scope as it is an ability and training scope. Because you could have a female recruit come in who's super fit and can do pull-ups and still has to do, progression. And then you'll have a male recruit who comes in and can't do jack all, right?
Right.
But
right.
it's still told to do pull-ups, right? So when I think about the playbook being gender neutral, it's good if it's implemented from an ability standpoint.
Yes.
So everyone's always being challenged.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm so happy to hear you say that, because that's how Training and Education Command and the athletic trainers approached it. And I was hoping that we had moved in the right direction and that you weren't going to tell us that we needed to go back because they did approach it from an ability perspective. And so I'm very, very happy to hear that.
And now you just have to layer on the
Yes.
periodization of the training.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Thank you.
the key. Yep.
That was a great question. Ma'am, Dr. Sims, you had mentioned when we did the pre-call about how our gear, even you've fielded a lot of questions from some of our female soldier sisters about wearing the pack correctly and how to properly train for that. I don't know if you could touch on that too, because that was so insightful.
Yeah, so almost all the gear across the board for firefighters, for military soldiers, for police, it's all based on the male body. And there are different center of gravity aspects where a male center of gravity is lower than a woman's. So if you're thinking about packs and you're putting a pack on, women end up going like this and walking like this, jackknifed, right? Because you're putting more weight at their already high center of gravity, pulls them forward. Where men, their center of gravity is lower, so you put a high pack and they're not jackknifed. They're able to relegate it out. So the emphasis of low back and posterior chain and injuries in this area from wearing heavy packs is really severe for women. So when you're focusing on the gear that you have to carry and the weight you have to carry, it's the focus on not necessarily the core here, but getting all the posterior super strong. Not only that, but women are quad dominant already. So people who are doing a lot of front squats for work, you need to switch to back squats, deadlifts, working the posterior chain to get all of this firing so that you're not jackknifed. You need to think about where's your center of gravity. You're already up here. So you don't want to start working all the stuff here that's going to pull you forward. You want to work all of this that's going to help you mitigate the fact that all of the designs of the packs and the safety equipment is based on male physiology. So it's just something to think about when you're looking at all the things that you have to wear and do, having the eye of, yeah, it's based on men and I'm different as a woman. What are some of the things I have to do to help myself remain uninjured so that I can be strong enough and I can do what I need to do by carrying this pack that is made for men.
Thank you, ma'am. I heard that was really insightful. Colonel Posey, ma'am, did you have another question?
I was just going to say amen. Thank you for saying that, because that was our biggest challenge at 4th Battalion was ill-fitting gear and trying to modify it to fit smaller bodies that it was not designed to fit, and then educating the recruits, the drill instructors, the officers there on how to wear it to mitigate what Dr. Sims just talked about. And that was a challenge. So thank you for mentioning that.
You're welcome. I love it how they're like, well, we can adjust the straps, and they forget that women have boobs, right? So then they're like, let's adjust the straps, and it becomes like this boob squisher that's even more uncomfortable. Yeah, so there's still a long way to go with equipment.
It's definitely one of the issues we're going to be tackling here with this WIT team. Colleen, you have a question.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you again for coming and echoing all of the great thank yous. This has been phenomenal. My question lies more as a health community as a whole, maybe not more even specific to the Marine Corps. Are we headed in a better direction for women in this area overall? How is it compared to the civilian sector in terms of, are we moving forward, or have you seen differences since you first started out and noticed these changes? Hopefully you can share something a little positive for us moving forward.
Yeah, I can say in the past 5 years, I've seen a significant shift to what is the difference between men and women and how do we improve the health and the well-being of every woman. I kind of get frustrated because the NIH put out a mandate back in the early 2000s that you had to include women in research, but it's just not until the past 5 years that it's really been held, like people are being held accountable for it. Even being called out on the New York Times. Like I got into a Twitter argument with this research group who put blatantly in their research article, we didn't study women because they have a menstrual cycle. I was like, no, that's not appropriate. And it was in the New York Times as this great new study that came out. And I was like, well, one, it was done on men, and two, they're just blatantly denying women. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to do that because I would have been like the outlier and no one would have these conversations. So the positive scope is there's more and more people who are being open, aware, supportive, and really pushing forward the research for women across the board. When we get to the peri and postmenopausal women, that's probably going to be another 5 years down the track when that conversation's been normalized. But at least people are starting to talk about it. So the short answer is yes, there's movement forward. Knowing that when I was starting everything, the idea of testing women because we're women was completely foreign. And now we're like, yeah, we can test women and we'll design it properly to get all sorts of things in there. So
Great news. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Dr. Sims, we really cannot thank you enough for all the time that you've given us. And I know that you blew a lot of our minds, even though I've listened so much to your books and podcasts and things. I learned something new every single time. So thank you. And I cannot wait for your perimenopause and menopause book to come out next, because that's going to be a game changer for a lot of aging athletes. So thank you. And if there's no final questions here, I just really, again, want to say we are so grateful, and I hope that we'll see an uptick in readiness here now, and just an increase in our national security, just because women learned a lot today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It's been fun. And I love doing this. I love being able to educate and empower women. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to me. So thank you.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to stop recording.